I was 14 when my life collapsed under a single wave of accusations, and sometimes I still hear the echo of that night in my dreams. I'd come home an hour past my curfew, my heart pounding as I imagined the reprimand that I might get for being late. I never expected what was actually waiting for me. My father stood on the porch, arms crossed, eyes fixed on me like I was already guilty of something more than tardiness. He said nothing at first, just nodded for me to go inside. In the living room, my mother paced in a tight circle by the window, swallowing nervous tears, and my older brother, Mark, sat in Dad's chair, his lips curved into this oddly triumphant sneer. Dad told me to sit. When I did, he began listing out a series of shocking accusations. That I'd stolen money from his wallet, that I'd broken into Mom's jewelry box for quick cash, and that I'd lied about spending the weekend with a friend. I thought I was dreaming, or that there was some awful misunderstanding because the charges were flat out false. My head spun as I tried to interrupt, to plead my case, but Dad wasn't listening. Nobody was. He told me to answer for myself, so I insisted I hadn't touched a single dollar of his money. I'd never gone near Mom's jewelry. And I was exactly where I said I would be, at my friend Julian's house, where we studied for a geography test and played video games until midnight. Before I could properly defend myself, Mark chimed in with all the details he'd apparently fed my parents. He claimed he'd caught me sneaking into Dad's bedroom, rummaging through the drawers, stuffing bills in my pocket. He said he'd followed me to a store downtown where I supposedly bought junk food and cheap trinkets, then lied about my whereabouts. The way he told it, I was on the verge of joining some shady crew of older kids. He painted this elaborate picture that left my parents speechless. Yet, I watched how Mom and Dad never questioned him. They never said, "Show us proof." They just believed him. Mark was the golden son, after all, honor roll student, star athlete, the one who could do no wrong. I tried to speak calmly, but my fear seeped into every syllable. I didn't do anything, I swear. Mark, why are you lying? He just shook his head, a dramatic gesture meant to convey disappointment in me. Dad's face hardened. Mom's tears glistened like a reflection of her shock. She glanced from me to Mark as though trying to decide which child she knew best. Then Dad yelled, "Pack a bag! I won't tolerate a thief in this house. If you're going to betray our trust, you can't stay under my roof." I remember every word. Even though it's been years, I can still see the tremble in Mom's hands as she wrung them near her chest. She never spoke up for me. She never told Dad to calm down, to double-check the facts. I sensed she was torn, but fear or guilt kept her silent. I did what Dad said. I dragged a small duffel from my closet and stuffed it with whatever clothes I could grab in a hurry. I tucked the photograph of me and my friend Julian at summer camp inside a shoe so it wouldn't get bent. I remember looking around my room, feeling paralyzed by the finality of it all, not knowing where I'd sleep that night. Then Mark appeared in the doorway, blocking my exit. He didn't even look remorseful. He said, "Just go. It's better for everyone." I felt a flash of anger so hot that my cheeks burned, but I had no plan, no voice in that moment. I just lowered my eyes, pushed past him, and left my home. I ended up at Julian's place that first night, lying about why I needed a place to crash. I couldn't face telling the truth. After a few days, I wore out my welcome. Julian's parents asked polite but persistent questions. I mumbled something about family troubles, not wanting them to feel obligated to keep me. With no money, I had to figure out where to go next. I spent hours in a park, numb and cold, watching buses drive by. I considered stowing away on one just to escape the city, but I didn't even have the bus fare for a short trip. At 15, my options were dangerously limited. That was when I started couch surfing with distant acquaintances, kids I knew from school who offered me a spare couch, though few had families who'd let me stay long. Meanwhile, Mark's rumor gained ground. People at school whispered that I was a thief who'd stolen from my own parents. Teachers seemed wary, uncertain how to approach me. It was humiliating, but the worst part was the betrayal itself. My own brother had woven a poisonous tale that left me exiled. My parents believed him without hesitation. I was too afraid, too dispirited to even argue more. Every time I considered confronting them, the memory of Dad's stony face and Mom's tears made me freeze. I dropped out of school by 16. Survival took priority over coursework. I found part-time jobs, scraping together enough to pay rent for a tiny room in a shared house. My roommates were older, mostly dealing with their own struggles. Some had addictions, some had criminal records. I tried to steer clear of trouble because the idea of winding up in jail terrified me. Ironically, being called a thief pushed me to the opposite extreme. I became obsessively honest about everything I did. I wouldn't touch anyone's property without permission, for fear they'd accuse me again. That rumor had corroded my sense of security forever. Despite the chaos, I managed to educate myself in unconventional ways. Whenever I wasn't at work, where I stocked shelves at a discount supermarket, I spent time at the public library. Reading gave me solace. I devoured books on psychology, business, real estate, personal finance, anything that might offer a glimmer of hope for a better future. I taught myself how to draft a resume, how to plan a budget, how to approach potential mentors for advice. The internet became my stealthy guide. Late at night, I watched videos about people who started with nothing and rose to success. It gave me something to cling to, proof that reinvention was possible. By 18, I'd saved just enough to rent a cramped studio apartment. It was nothing special, peeling paint, leaky sink, a mattress on the floor, but it was mine. Nobody could kick me out. I cut ties with almost everyone I knew from childhood, except Julian. He always believed me about the false rumors, and though we drifted apart as life got in the way, we kept sporadic contact. My parents never once tried to reach me, or if they did, I changed phone numbers too frequently for them to succeed. A part of me mourned the absence of that unconditional love I'd once trusted. Another part of me was livid that they'd pick Mark's words over mine. My hatred for Mark simmered. I often replayed that night in my head, analyzing his expressions, searching for a reason he wanted me gone. Maybe he felt threatened by me. Maybe he just craved the drama. He was older by 2 years, popular, used to dominating every conversation. I was quieter, more introspective. It might have galled him that I sometimes outperformed him in certain subjects, or it could have been about something else entirely, like wanting mom and dad's attention for himself. I didn't know, but no matter the cause, the damage was done. And I promised myself, if I ever rose above this, there would be no forgiveness for anyone who cast me away so casually. I worked multiple jobs, grabbing overtime whenever possible, and saved relentlessly. People my age went to parties or took vacation trips. I spent nights working graveyard shifts at an office supply warehouse, loading and unloading trucks. By my early 20s, I'd accumulated enough savings to start a small business venture, a modest online shop reselling electronics. It began in the corner of my studio. I'd buy used laptops and phones, refurbish them, and list them for sale. It was tedious. My knowledge was limited, but my determination was fierce. Eventually, I found a reliable supplier who offered refurbished products in bulk, and I expanded. I handled customer service, shipping, social media marketing, everything alone. The hustle was intense, but it began to pay off. In time, I rented a tiny office space, hired a part-time assistant, developed a brand that specialized in affordable tech for students and budget-conscious families. I built relationships with distributors who gave me discounts on slightly outdated models that I'd fix up and sell. The profit margins were slim at first, but the business grew steadily. While others might have borrowed money from relatives or relied on family support, I did every inch of it on my own. Pride fueled my efforts. I wanted to succeed out of pure grit, to prove that I wasn't who they'd labeled me to be. It was around my 23rd birthday when the business finally felt stable. I rewarded myself by upgrading from that decrepit studio to a modest one-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood. Stepping into that new space felt surreal. No leaky pipes, no peeling paint. It was clean, bright, and mine. I invited Julian over for pizza and cheap champagne. We toasted to the future, both of us laughing at how far we'd come. He'd finished some technical training and found a solid job as an auto mechanic. We joked about the many times we'd slept on floors or shared microwaved meals just to survive. Our bond, forged through adversity, was ironclad. That same year, I experienced an odd twist of fate. One evening, I received a message from an unknown number. It read, "We need to talk. It's urgent. Please call." There was no name attached. I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but something told me to call just in case. A woman's voice answered. She paused, then said, "It's Mom." My stomach twisted in knots. I held the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. My first thought was that something terrible had happened, like Dad was in the hospital. But she hastily said Dad was fine, physically at least. She wanted to meet, face to face, to discuss some important family matters. I felt numb, so I told her I'd think about it. Then I hung up. For days, I wrestled with the decision. Part of me was curious about why she was reaching out after nearly a decade. Another part of me was furious. Where was she when I was sleeping in parks, living off vending machine food? When I was forced to work 3 jobs just to keep a roof over my head? Eventually, curiosity and maybe a residual longing for closure made me agree to meet her. I suggested a busy coffee shop near my new place, neutral territory. I spotted her immediately. She was older, of course, lines etched into her face that I'd never seen before. Her once dark hair was streaked with gray, and she fiddled with the straps of her handbag, looking nervous. When I approached her table, she jumped up, eyes brimming with tears. She tried to hug me. I sidestepped slightly, making the embrace awkward. I couldn't help it. A decade of pain doesn't vanish at a simple reunion. We sat. She sipped her coffee, stalling, until I said, "Why did you want to see me?" She exhaled shakily, explained in a halting voice that the family had gone through financial troubles. Dad lost his job due to company downsizing. Mark had borrowed money for some misguided investment and defaulted. Their home was on the verge of foreclosure. They were desperate. Then she heard through some mutual acquaintance that I had started a successful business. She made a big show of praising me. How proud she was that I turned my life around. How she always knew I was exceptional. I felt a bitter laugh creep up my throat because if she'd believed I was so exceptional, why did she let Dad banish me over a rumor? She finally reached the point. They needed a loan to save the house. Mark had moved back in, apparently jobless, and they were drowning in debt. "I know we haven't been in touch," Mom said, wringing her hands, "but you're still family. We thought maybe you could help." She patted my hand across the table as if it were the simplest thing in the world. My jaw tensed so hard it hurt. I had a rush of memories. Dad roaring that I was a thief, Mark smirking as he watched me pack my bag, me sleeping on threadbare couches, skipping meals to save money. And now they had the gall to come begging? For a moment, I said nothing. I let the silence grow thick between us. Then I asked about Dad. She said he was too ashamed to come, that he'd wanted to, but felt sure I wouldn't agree to talk if he showed up. She also mentioned Mark, how he'd apologized to her for the drama he caused as a teenager. Hearing that made me grip my mug until I thought it might shatter. I nearly walked out right then. Instead, I calmly said, "No." She blinked, stunned. I repeated it. "No, I can't help." She looked like I'd slapped her. She tried to protest, to say we could work out a repayment plan. But I shook my head. I reminded her, as politely as I could manage, that she and Dad once believed me capable of theft. So maybe it was safer if we didn't mix money and family. Then I stood up. She pleaded, "We're about to lose the house. It's all we have left." And I paused just long enough to say, "Then I guess you shouldn't have believed Mark's lies." I left her at the table, tears gathering on her lashes. I told myself that was the end, that I wouldn't let them back into my life. Revenge, for me, was served in that moment. The cold refusal, the confrontation that left her powerless. I couldn't deny there was a vicious satisfaction in denying them after they'd abandoned me. Yet, the story didn't end there. A month later, Dad emailed me directly. His tone was different, more stern, almost demanding. He wrote, "You are still our child, and family is obligated to help each other. We took care of you for 14 years. It's your turn to help us in our time of need." It was unbelievable. He had the nerve to phrase it that way, like I owed him a debt for basic parenting. I stared at the screen, disbelief warring with anger. Then I deleted his message without replying. Another couple of weeks went by, and I got a phone call from Mark. I didn't pick up the first time, but he tried again and again. Eventually, I answered just to tell him off. Before I could unleash my fury, he spoke in a harried, desperate tone. "Look, I know what I did was messed up. I lied. I know that. I was jealous and I wanted you gone, but everything's different now. I'm sorry. You have to believe me. We need your help." There was a deep shame in his voice, but also a sense of entitlement. He assumed an apology was enough. I listened in silence, my skin tingling with rage. Then I asked, "Why did you lie about me stealing? What on earth did I ever do to you?" He paused, and I could almost hear him swallowing his guilt. He said, "Dad always compared us, you know? He'd say how you got better grades in certain subjects, how you seemed more mature. I hated feeling second rate, so I started making up rumors, and it got out of hand. I never meant for it to go that far." His explanation only stoked my anger. "You never meant for Dad to kick me out?" I asked sarcastically. He stuttered, "No, well, yes, Dad was so angry it just escalated. He begged for forgiveness, said it weighed heavily on him all these years. I refused to absolve him. Do you even know what my life was like afterward? I almost ended up in the street permanently because of you. You want a second chance?" I laughed bitterly. "I'm not giving you that satisfaction." I hung up on him. My heart hammered in my chest. Maybe some part of me wanted closure, but the betrayal was too deep. I wouldn't let him manipulate me again. In the following months, they kept trying. Mom left voicemails, sometimes sobbing, sometimes chastising me for my cruelty. Dad wrote another email saying I was acting irrationally by refusing to help. Mark sent texts promising to do anything for a second chance. I blocked all of them. My mind churned at night, remembering all the times I'd craved their presence, how it used to hurt that they never came to find me. Now I realized that even their regret was self-serving, fueled by financial desperation. Maybe they felt some guilt, but I also suspected they just saw me as a lifeline. If they truly cared, they would have reached out when I was still scrounging for food. Around that time, my business took another leap. We landed a large contract with a regional educational foundation looking to provide refurbished laptops for underprivileged kids. The contract was lucrative. Suddenly, I was in a position to expand, to hire more staff. At 25, I found myself overseeing a small team of employees. That success felt surreal, considering my background. One day, while finalizing an order, I reflected on how many families might be impacted by our work. I could have been proud, maybe I was, but mostly, I felt a grim determination never to slip backward, never to let anyone drag me down. A friend of mine, a marketing consultant named Rebecca, encouraged me to share my rags to riches story on social media to boost the brand's image. At first, I resisted, not wanting the attention, but eventually I agreed to do a short interview for a local business blog. The journalist asked about my upbringing, how I found the drive to succeed. I gave a vague answer about facing hardships and being kicked out as a teenager over misunderstandings. I left out the painful details. The article was published, generating sympathetic comments and admiration. My parents must have seen it too, because that's around the time they escalated again. One evening, there was a knock on my apartment door. Thinking it was a delivery, I opened up without checking the peephole. I was stunned to see Mom and Dad standing there, shoulders slumped like they'd practiced a sorrowful pose. I froze, unsure whether to shut the door or let them speak. Dad cleared his throat and said, "We know you're upset. We know we made mistakes. But this is critical. We're in huge trouble." My pulse raced, my anger flaring. I wanted to scream, to remind them of every sleepless night I'd endured, every humiliating moment. Instead, I said, "Go away." Dad shoved his foot in the doorway so I couldn't close it. Mom pleaded, "Please, just hear us out." They walked in uninvited, determined. Dad explained that Mark's mistakes had led to legal complications. He'd apparently borrowed money from shady lenders, used the family home as collateral. Mom and Dad were on the brink of losing everything, and the interest rates were skyrocketing. He asked if I could give them a lump sum to cover the debt. He even had a typed document for me to sign, an official loan agreement, but the terms were laughable. It was basically a request for me to assume the risk without any guarantee I'd be repaid. I stared at them, my lips trembling with fury. I asked, "Do you have any idea what you put me through?" Mom teared up again, said they regretted everything, that they were sorry for believing Mark's lies. Dad nodded stiffly, like it physically pained him to admit wrongdoing. "We shouldn't have thrown you out," he said, "but we thought you were—" I cut him off. "You thought I was a thief. What proof did you have? None. You abandoned your own child." Mom whimpered. "We were misled." My anger boiled over. "Misled? You didn't even try to ask me. You just kicked me out in the middle of the night." I wanted them to taste the desperation I'd felt. They hovered, silent, waiting. Finally, I said, "You need money, right?" Their eyes lit with hope. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and gestured outside. For a moment, I saw relief wash over their faces, like they assumed I was going to grab my checkbook. But the next words out of my mouth crushed that hope. I said, "Get out! I'm not lending you a penny. You owe me far more than money could repay, and you'll never get my help." Mom started to cry. Dad tried to scold me, but I stepped forward, forcing him out of my space. They drifted into the hallway, sputtering protests. I slammed the door shut. I stood there for a long time, chest heaving, tears burning my eyes, but tears of anger, not sorrow. I felt a perverse kind of triumph, like I'd reclaimed my own dignity. A few weeks later, Mark showed up at my office. One of my employees buzzed me to say a distressed man was in the lobby. I knew immediately who it was. I considered calling security, but a part of me was curious about what he'd say this time. I walked out to find him pacing near the reception desk. He looked thinner, his eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. He was wearing wrinkled clothes. He seemed desperate. "Please," he said softly, glancing around at my employees who were pretending not to watch. "Can we talk in private?" I nodded toward a small conference room. Once inside, he barely waited for me to close the door before he started begging. "I know you hate me," he said. "I deserve it, but Mom and Dad, they're going to be evicted. This is all my fault. I messed up. If I lose the house, it'll destroy them. Please, just a little help. I'll do anything." I watched him, remembering how he'd looked the night he watched me pack my bag. Smug, certain he'd just rid himself of a problem. Now the roles were reversed. I folded my arms, leaning against the conference table. "Anything?" I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. He nodded fervently. "Yes, whatever you say." I took a moment to study him. A twisted satisfaction stirred inside me, but I was no saint. I'd fantasized about seeing him like this, pleading with me, powerless. Yet a part of me also wondered if I was crossing into cruelty. Then I remembered the nights I'd shivered outside, the mocking stares at school, the loneliness that had eaten away at my spirit. So I said, "I don't need anything from you. I don't want your apologies or your deals. I just want you gone." The finality of my statement made him flinch. "You really won't help?" he whispered. I let out a clipped laugh. "You ruined my life when I was 14. Why would I lift a finger for you now?" He sank into a chair, head in his hands, shoulders shaking. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt pity. Then I reminded myself that he wasn't mourning my past hardships. He was mourning his own predicament. I turned my back and walked out, leaving him there to sob into his palms. My receptionist gave me a questioning glance as I passed. "Call security if he won't leave," I said. She nodded, looking uneasy. I went back to my desk, scrolled through emails for a distraction, and tried to ignore the swirl of emotions in my chest. He must have left quietly because I heard no commotion. That night, I got a text from him, the last I'd ever receive. "I get it. You hate me. I wish I could undo what I did. I can't. I'm sorry." I deleted it instantly. I had no space in my life for half-baked repentance. I'd spent too many years in the darkness that he helped create. Soon after, a relative of mine, an aunt I barely knew, left a message claiming Mom and Dad had lost the house, that they were living in a cramped apartment, drowning in debt. She said they looked ill, depressed, that Mark was unemployed and drifting. In her tone, I sensed condemnation, as if I were partly to blame for not swooping in to rescue them. The audacity made me tremble. I blocked her number too, deciding I wasn't responsible for that side of the family anymore. My life went on. My company continued to grow, moving to a bigger office, hiring new employees. I established a scholarship fund for at-risk youth, specifically those who'd been kicked out or were homeless, wanting to give them the help I'd never received. Each time I signed one of those scholarship checks, I felt a quiet sense of purpose. This was my family now, people who truly needed and appreciated assistance, who wouldn't turn on me based on a rumor. Time blurred. I turned 27, then 28. A lot changed. I expanded my business into new markets, got a nice condo with a skyline view, and took up hiking as a weekend escape from the city's grind. I started seeing a therapist as well because my anger and lingering resentment sometimes bled into my personal life. It helped me understand that seeking revenge was normal, but letting it consume me forever would only poison my happiness. Still, forgiveness was off the table. My therapist asked me once if I'd consider letting my parents or Mark back into my life. I said, "They don't deserve that. and I respect myself too much to pretend otherwise. She said forgiveness could be for my own peace. I told her my peace came from cutting toxic people out. Even so, I couldn't help but occasionally browse social media for glimpses of them. I found Mark's profile. His posts were sporadic, mostly lamenting job rejections. He had no photos of a spouse or kids. He mentioned our parents once in a status update, saying he felt responsible for their downfall. It had a handful of sympathy comments. I rolled my eyes, closed the page, and moved on. Then, about a year later, something unexpected happened. A law firm contacted me, telling me there'd been a car accident involving Dad. He was badly hurt, might not survive. My first reaction was a tangled mix of shock and numbness. They said Dad had designated me, along with Mark, as someone to be notified in emergencies. Why would he do that if we were estranged? Maybe guilt or parental instinct. They gave me the name of the hospital. That evening, I paced my condo, debating whether to go. Ultimately, I decided to see him, if only to confront him at the edge of his mortality. I arrived at the hospital late, found Mom sobbing in the hallway. She looked terrible, like she'd aged a century. Mark was in a chair, head down. When Mom saw me, she rushed forward, sobbing, "Oh, thank God you're here!" She tried to grasp my hands, but I held them behind my back. She crumpled, tears streaking down her cheeks. Mark just stared at the floor. I asked what the doctors said. Mom explained Dad was in critical condition, not sure if he'd make it through the night. My chest felt tight, but not entirely with sorrow, more a swirl of old wounds. Mom asked if I'd see him. I hesitated, then nodded. Mark was silent. I entered the ICU, the beep of monitors and hiss of oxygen filling the air. Dad lay there, pale, tubes in his arms, eyes closed. A nurse said he wasn't conscious, but sometimes patients could still hear. I stood by his bed, heart pounding. I thought about all the words I might say. How he failed me, how he chose to believe a lie, how he never apologized except when he needed something. But no words came, just a numbness, a sense that this man was a stranger. Eventually, I turned away, leaving him as I'd found him, unaware. When I stepped back into the hall, Mom was trembling with emotion, maybe expecting me to comfort her. Instead, I said nothing. She sniffled. "We don't have insurance to cover this. The bills are—" I cut her off, my voice flat. "I can't help you." She choked on her tears. I walked out, ignoring Mark's stare. Outside, the cold air bit my cheeks as I realized I felt no remorse. The father who'd thrown me to the wolves might die without ever hearing an apology from me. But then again, I owed him nothing. The next morning, I got a text from Mark. "Dad woke up. He's stable. He wants to see you." I ignored it. I had a staff meeting that day and more pressing concerns. Later, curiosity led me to read Mark's follow-up messages. "He needs you. He's asking for you. He said he wants to make amends. He's sorry." That last phrase looked so hollow on the screen. I turned off my phone, focusing on my work. Over the next week, the messages continued, describing how Dad was begging for me, that he confessed how wrong he'd been, how he regretted everything. Mom added her own pleas. I never replied, not once. Time passed. Dad recovered slowly, though I didn't follow his journey except through the occasional updates Mark tried to send me. Each one went unanswered. I didn't block him this time. Maybe I wanted to watch how desperate they'd get, how they'd squirm, how they'd beg. In their emails, they said Dad cried for me at night, that he wished he could undo the past. Good for him, I thought. Let him feel the heaviness of all he'd broken. Months slid by, and eventually the messages dwindled. At some point, Dad was released from the hospital, but they couldn't pay the full medical bills. I heard from a cousin that they'd likely have to declare bankruptcy. Mark had moved to a small rental apartment nearby. The cousin expressed disapproval at my refusal to help. I simply said, "Where were they when I was hungry and alone?" She had no good answer. I kept living. My business thrived. Julian and I reconnected more frequently, laughing over old memories and marveling at how life can turn upside down. We'd go to dinners, watch sporting events, toss around ideas for future ventures. I made new friends, explored new hobbies. Eventually, I started dating seriously for the first time, though I was cautious about trusting anyone. Over time, that caution eased, and I found genuine companionship. My past shaped me, but it didn't define me. One day, I stumbled upon an old photo in my storage boxes. It was from when I was about 8, with Mom, Dad, and Mark at a local fair. We were smiling at the camera, funnel cakes in hand, eyes bright with happiness. My throat tightened. I remembered that day vividly. We'd ridden a Ferris wheel. We'd laughed so much that my sides hurt. I'd believed we were an unbreakable unit. I felt a pang of sadness. Then, like a reflex, anger flared again. They'd thrown all that away. Mark had lied and destroyed my trust, and my parents had chosen to believe him. I set the photo aside, uncertain if I'd keep it or toss it. In the end, I tucked it in a drawer, a reminder of who they once were and how quickly that bond disintegrated. Years on, people sometimes ask about my family. I learned to answer neutrally, we're not close. Then, if they push, I might say, they kicked me out as a teenager, we never reconciled. Some folks are horrified, some pity me, some admire that I've achieved success regardless. I don't bother explaining that I relish my independence now, that my self-respect hinges on never letting them back in. I believe in second chances for many things in life, but not for those who left me for dead when I was just a confused kid. My parents and my brother taught me a harsh lesson. Trust is a fragile thing, and once shattered, no apology can truly piece it back together. I sometimes imagine what it would be like if I had a family that supported me, if I'd never been forced to fend for myself. Maybe I'd have gone to college, joined clubs, had carefree teenage years. Instead, I learned survival early, discovered self-reliance, and poured my energy into building a life free of their influence. It shaped me into someone stronger, but it cost me the innocence of youth. Do I resent it? Sometimes. But if bitterness were a fire, it would have burned me to cinders long ago. I carry just enough anger to remain vigilant to keep my boundaries firm, but not so much that I can't move forward. Now, I run a growing company that employs dozens of people. I give back to the community, especially to kids who've been cast aside. I see them fighting for a place in the world, just like I did, and I want to show them someone cares, even if their own families abandon them. That's how I channel my experiences into something meaningful. Whenever I'm asked to donate to a cause, I pick organizations that cater to youth in crisis. Each time, I remind myself that some of these kids might be exactly where I was at 14, alone, scared, distrustful of everyone. And if my contribution helps one of them hang on and find their path, it feels like a victory. I've never heard any more from Dad. Maybe he learned that I'd never respond. Maybe his health is too precarious for more drama, or maybe he just can't face the shame. Mom stopped calling too, presumably because each call was met with silence. Mark still sends occasional emails, usually around the holidays, short messages that say he's sorry and hopes I'm well. I never write back. I suppose part of him still craves forgiveness so he can stop feeling guilty. That's not my problem. He lit the fuse that blew our family to pieces, and he'll have to live with that. Sometimes people wonder if holding on to so much resentment is healthy. I tell them I'm not consumed by vengeance anymore, not in my day-to-day life. I'm happy, successful, and comfortable, but I see no reason to pretend those who harmed me deserve a place in my life. That boundary isn't poison, it's protection. My childhood taught me that the closest people to you can cause the deepest wounds. Once I recognized that, I decided never to let them wield that power over me again. It's not some theatrical revenge. It's my firm stance that there are consequences for cruelty, and those consequences can last a lifetime. If they were counting on the unconditional forgiveness narrative that some families cling to, they chose the wrong person to betray. The future feels open and bright for me. I have plans to launch a second business line, focusing on software solutions. I might travel more, see places I only read about in library books years ago. My past never disappears. Trauma leaves marks that can't be fully erased, but it doesn't define my every step. It's a shadow, a reminder to be careful whom I trust. Maybe, in time, my story will serve as a warning or an inspiration to others. If so, that's enough. When I think about my parents now, I picture that final scene in my apartment hallway, them begging for help. Or the hospital corridor where Mom's eyes brimmed with tears and Dad lay unconscious. Those moments are etched in my memory as proof that life can circle back in unexpected ways. Their desperation mirrored my own teenage desperation, but the crucial difference was that I found a way forward on my own. They expected me to bend to their pleas. I refused, because once you've taken everything from a person, You can't stroll back in and demand their support. I've accepted that we'll never reconcile. I've accepted that my brother and parents will live with the repercussions of their decisions. People say revenge is about making the other party suffer, but for me, it's simply about denying them access to my hard-earned success. Every day I wake up in my own home, run my own business, and choose my own path. That's my revenge. And that's enough. The other day, I scrolled through some old emails I'd kept in a hidden folder, messages from my parents and Mark during that period. They relentlessly pursued me. I read them dispassionately, noting how quickly they shifted from apologies to angry demands when they realized I wouldn't budge. I smirked at their desperation, then closed the folder for good. It struck me that I felt more indifference than rage now, like I'd reached a place of closure on my own terms. Because this is my life, not theirs. They lost the privilege of calling me family the night they believed a lie and cast me aside. And if that decision haunts them now, I can't say I'm sorry. They made their bed, they can lie in it. All I can do is move forward, carrying my scars as proof that I survived, thrived, and emerged stronger. My trust is hard to earn, but my loyalty is unwavering when deserved. For them, there's no second chance. There's no path back into my heart or my wallet. I owe them nothing. And that final truth is the sweetest form of justice I can imagine.